Hi, in this video we're going to start talking about our vertebrates by talking about the first one to evolve, which is the fish. So before we can begin, we need to just speak briefly about what a fish is. So a fish is a term we use a lot. We'll talk more about that, but for our purposes, a fish is going to be a vertebrate that isn't a tetrapod or any of its descendants. So a tetrapod is a four-legged land animal. A descendant, like a whale, came from something that had four legs, so that counts too. Another way of looking at fish is that they are aquatic vertebrates with fins, scales, and gills. So let's talk more about that. So first, they are exothermic. Of course, that means that they're cold-blooded, which allows them to live in most aquatic environments. However, life in really cold water can be tough. So consequently, they have proteins that act as antifreeze in their blood to help prevent them from freezing during really cold water. Another adaptation fish have that help them survive is a swim bladder. A swim bladder acts as a little balloon that can inflate or deflate to help them control their depth. So a swim bladder is this structure here in a fish and here in the diagram, and again that can inflate or deflate to help control their depth. Some fish, like sharks, don't have swim bladders, and so consequently they produce an oily substance called squalene in their liver, and that helps them control their buoyancy. Additionally, as you know, most fish have a fair amount of fins. Fins have a number of purposes. We usually think of them as steering and propulsion, but fins have a lot of uses. The back fin goes back and forth like this, and that's their main propulsion. So they really only propel themselves with their tail, at least most fish. The other fins are mostly for stability and steering. Let's pause here to review and to catch up with notes. Another important characteristic found in most fish is what we call a lateral line system. So lateral line, you can see from the external anatomy on a fish, is this line here, hence line apart of the lateral line. And if you recall from your anatomical terms, lateral means side. So it's a line along their side. That is a sensory mechanism. So that has little tiny hair-like structures called copulas, and they detect changes in the water. It helps a fish sense their environment. Now, as we talked about each different phyla, we've discussed how they get rid of cellular waste. So as you know, we have nephridia, we have flame cells, Malpighian tubes. In fish, they get rid of their waste the same way we do. They get rid of it with kidneys. Obviously, their kidneys work a little bit differently than ours, but the idea is the same. They have what we call a glomulus, and that glomulus helps filter salt, NaCl, from their blood. And the way that they filter it is a little bit different in marine fish, ones that live in salt water, versus aquatic fish, those that live in fresh water. So in fresh water, of course, they have to deal with a much lower salt concentration, whereas in salt water, they have to deal with a much higher salt concentration. And so keeping that balance so as not to take in too much water or get rid of too much water for osmosis is super important, because if they didn't maintain that, they would either bloat or they would basically die of thirst. Of course, all organisms also need to be able to get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. With fish, obviously, that's through their gills. We've talked a little bit about gills already, but let's just quickly review how gills work. So in a fish, they take in water through their mouth, and then their water comes out the flap that they have behind their eyes. That flap is called an operculum, and the operculum is the exit hole, and inside the operculum are gills. And in the gills, on the gill filaments, what we see is a whole bunch of blood vessels. And as the water flows over it, it diffuses with carbon dioxide, which is in higher concentration in the blood that's just been through their bodies, diffuses out of the blood vessels, and the oxygen, which is in higher concentration in the water, diffuses into them. And again, that flap that controls the exit of water is called the operculum. Circulation is important when we talk about respiration. Circulation, of course, is how the blood moves through the body. And in fish, they have a single loop heart. So that means that it makes one loop. Ours is a double loop. So from our heart, it goes from our heart to our lungs, back to our heart, and then to our body. A fish just has one loop. So from their heart to the gills, to their body, and then back to the heart. But it is completely closed, so all of the blood is contained in vessels. Let's take a moment to pause for notes and review. The last body system we're going to talk about with fish is their reproduction. So first off, we have to point out that it varies greatly. Some fish are oviparous and some fish are ovoviviparous. But some generalities we can say. So most of them are oviparous. So remember, that means they lay eggs. And those that lay eggs typically have external fertilization. That, of course, means that there are strategists, which also means that they have precocial young. So I'm sorry, guys, Finding Nemo is not accurate. Marlin would never have taken care of Nemo. However, there are some fish that have parental care. So this is a cichlid, and I don't know how well you can see it in the picture, but those are its eggs in its mouth. So this is what we call a mouth brooder, which means that the larvae develop in their mouth, so they give a little bit of protection. Other fish, like sharks, actually do protect their young, and sharks have internal fertilization. So there's quite a bit of variation. If a fish swims upstream to spawn, in other words, it lives in the ocean and swims into a river to spawn, we call them andronymous. You probably don't need to worry about the vocabulary term andronymous. It's just more of an FYI. Let's quickly review fish reproduction. So the term fish, as we talked about with starfish, crayfish, etc., is a convenience term. It's not a taxonomic unit, so it's not a phyla, it's not a class, it's not a subphylum, it's just a group of vertebrates in this case. And remember that a lot of those ones that I mentioned, crayfish, starfish, shellfish, all of those aren't actually fish, at least the way we're talking about. So which ones are fish? So if we talk about it, the Metaspringia are a fossil that they found. Looks like this. Well, this is what they think it looked like when it was alive. And we think this is one of the, this is the earliest chordate that might have had some of the traits that we see in invertebrates. You can see here we've got the gill slits that will become the gills and throat area for vertebrates. So we have a long way to go from that basic chordate to a fish that we think of. So let's talk about some of the simplest ones that we now today of the living fishes that we talk about. And that's Agnatha is the jawless fish. So Agnatha looks like that. And they've got all kinds of characteristics, and I wouldn't begin to worry about writing them all down. So there's just a couple of things to point out. So they look like worms or snakes. So in other words, very few fins. They have a notochord, so they don't have traditional vertebrae like we have. They lack snails. We would include the lampreys and the hagfish. Now, hagfish are super awesome. Take a second and look at these.
Some of the first to attack the bait were hagfish, also known as snot eels. At one point, a kite-fin shark, uninterested in the bait, instead prefers the hagfish, but gets a mouthful of slime. The slime fills the shark's mouth, clogs its gills.
Check out this hagfish and its slime. You can see as soon as the person picks it up, right away it starts secreting the slime. How cool is that? So I show you that not because the hagfish has any supreme significance for our conversations, just because it's kind of cool. So after Agnatha, we come with a very important derived character that we see in every other vertebrate, and that is a jaw. Chondrichthyes have several important characteristics, and of course, the first one is having a jaw. They're also known as cartilaginous fish because, of course, they have cartilage but no bone. We do classify them as vertebrates, though, because although they don't have it made of bone, they do have vertebrae. You do want to make sure that you know that they are both rays and skates and sharks. So the sharks, of course, are carnivores. The rays and skates are like the stingrays. And one of the important characteristics that you'll probably be tested on, because of course we're dissecting them, is their scales. They have placoid scales, so those are scales that have very specific structures that you'll learn about in lab, very important, and to the touch, even though they may look smooth, they actually kind of have a sandpaper feel. The last and important type of fish are osteichthyes. The osteichthyes, the osta part refers to bone, so bony fish. Bony fish are the ones that we're probably most familiar with. They have the typical scales that you see on fish. They have a swim bladder, and there's a number of different clades within them. So they have a ray-finned fish. That's the ones we're typically used to seeing that have the real thin fins. That's, of course, most of them. However, we have another group called lobe-finned fishes. Those include lobe-finned fishes that have thicker, stronger bones in their fins, and some of them actually have lungs. Those would be a subgroup called lungfish. And those are the ones that we think eventually evolved into tetrapods, or land animals. If we take a look here, we can see here are all the vertebrates, and the tetrapods are just this last group. So all of the vertebrates descended from one group that made its way onto land. All of these guys we would consider types of fish. All right, let's take a moment for review one more time.